think we've got a bunch of people joining in, so we'll give them, as we were just saying, with connectivity issues, we'll give everybody a minute or two to get online, and then we can get started. Well, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everybody, and thank you for joining us for what I know is going to be a really insightful and interactive discussion. I know we have folks joining us as they get connected, but we're going to go ahead and get started because we've got an amazing panel and a really timely topic to talk about today, which is, of course, women's empowerment through trade policy. We are very lucky that we are joined by some very esteemed guests, as well as very good friends and partner organizations, including the Organization of Women in International Trade, WIIT, which of course is a global organization, personal and professional networking association that brings together women in the trade space for a range of topics and professional development opportunities. I know we've got chapter representation from across the planet today, so thank you all for joining us in advance. We also are thrilled to be able to partner with the International Trade Center on today's conversation and talk through the release of a groundbreaking report that they are putting out this week on mainstreaming gender and free trade agreements. My name's Lisa Schroeder. My day job is Global Director of Trade Policy for Dow, but I am also honored to be the past president of Women in International Trade DC, which is the Washington DC based chapter under WIIT's Great Global Leadership. So for our conversation today, there's a couple of things that we're going to do, but I think most importantly, and I want to throw this challenge out in advance to all of our participants, we really want to focus this conversation on catalyzing action. There have been so many conversations about women's empowerment through trade, and there's some terrific work going on around the planet. Many of our ambassadors represent governments that have really done historic and groundbreaking work in this space, including the inclusion of gender diversity in the new USMCA agreement, as has so many of our partner organizations, the World Trade Organization, the ITC, and the report that we're talking about today. We want to catalyze action with this discussion. How do we take this to the next stage and really make this part of the conversations as we talk through strategy about the next phase, particularly as we come through such challenging times in the trade policy world, as well as broadly. So with thanks in advance for everyone's participation and active engagement in this discussion, we want to go ahead and start off with asking Dorothy Timbo, the Executive Director ad interim of the ITC, took over that role in January 2020, but has been the Deputy Executive Director of the ITC since June of 2014. And I can't imagine someone more skilled or more capable of really walking us through not only the ITC's report, but how the 10 recommendations included in this document will really serve as a model and a roadmap for how we can all be encouraging more gender empowerment, especially at a time as we're thinking about economic recovery and resilience through our trade policy work, as well as the post-COVID environment. Ms. Tembo has worked in a range of areas around trade policy, everything from having served as the Executive Director of the Enhanced Integrated Framework Program at the WTO. We're really focused on trade-related technical assistance that built nicely on her previous work, certainly as the Chief Trade Negotiator for Zambia, as well as having worked to support a lot of trade development efforts at USAID in Zambia originally. So Dorothy, if I could turn to you, we'd very much like to hear about the work the ITC has done and the ideas that you have developed in terms of how we can be more active driving women's empowerment through trade.
Thank you very much, Lisa. It is indeed a great pleasure for us at the International Trade Center to be co-hosting this event with WIIT in the margins of the World Economic Forum Trade Multi-Stakeholder Conversation. In September 2015, all of us in the global community took 17 commitments to change the world. Fifth on that list was the commitment to achieve gender equality and empower women and girls. Here at ITC, we set out the task in earnest. Together with our partners, we launched the She Trades Initiative, ITC's flagship program with a target of connecting 3 million women to markets by 2021. Through She Trades, ITC has mainly focused on building women entrepreneurs' skill sets, helping them to add value to their products and services, and creating opportunities for them to meet and formalize deals with new investors and buyers. Over and above this, ITC is providing thought leadership on the global agenda of women's economic empowerment. A few months ago, we co-authored a publication on global economic governance entirely authored by women. Yesterday, on the margins of the UN High-Level Political Forum, we launched the She Trades Outlook, an online tool which maps how individual countries are performing against more than 80 trade and gender-related indicators. Today, thanks to the continued support of the UK government to She Trades, and for the methodology developed by Dr. Amrita Bahari, I'm pleased to announce the launch of a guidebook entitled On Mainstreaming Gender in Free Trade Agreements. Another effort that goes towards contributing, as you were saying, supporting countries to move towards having more concrete actions being taken forward and providing solutions that enable them as countries to advance the agenda on gender equality. While domestic policy and programs provide a major source of support to women in trade, there is too a role for trade policy. And there is too much at stake not to leverage it. In this context, the guide provides a menu of options which policymakers may use, including varying model clauses, to make their trade agreements more gender responsive. Having surveyed over 70 trade agreements across 25 countries, the publication explains 10 different approaches to crafting gender-inclusive trade policies, ranging from the use of binding legal quotas to the use of gender-specific monitoring committees. The publication is now online at shetrades.com, at shetrades.com. So I invite all of you to visit the site, and you delve into the details and to also apply the ideas which best suit the different country contexts. To conclude, I would like to share my own key takeaways. There is no one size fits all. That was very clear from the work that we have undertaken. There is a great disparity in how countries are mainstreaming gender in policies, ranging from introducing entire gender chapters or simply reaffirming previously made commitments under the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination against Women. There is also great disparity in the rate of progress when it comes to gender mainstreaming. The publication indicates a vast majority, almost 70% of trade agreements have limited gender responsiveness, meaning that they are gender blind or gender neutral, as they fail to mainstream gender concerns. On the other spectrum, only 5% of agreements have an advanced level of gender responsiveness, meaning these agreements mainstream gender concerns with the best use of best practices. Making trade policy more inclusive is not a cookie cutter exercise. Rather, it calls for engaging all key stakeholders in meaningful consultations and analysis to find solutions that work for each country. ITC will continue working towards the achievement of gender equality and women's economic empowerment. I do hope that this guidebook on mainstreaming gender in free trade agreements, as well as our other policy tools such as the She Trades Outlook, which I referred to a short while ago, provide policymakers with the ammunition needed to make their trade policies more inclusive for a better of women and indeed for a benefit of all. ITC recognizes that whilst we and other partners are in a position to support these processes at the country level, it remains critical that countries assume ownership. It's only when they're in the driving seat that things can begin to happen as they assume more ownership. Thank you very much.
Dorothy, thank you so much. What a great and thoughtful way to start off this conversation. And as we turn to our panel, and we have such incredible diplomatic expertise joining us today, I also should have mentioned to everyone, for our participants online, once we've gone, the panel's had a chance to make opening remarks and we start a discussion, if you have questions, comments, or items, additions to the conversation that you want to bring in, please do. I'm sure everyone's very familiar with Zoom functions these days. Either use chat or Q&A, and we'll make sure to make that part of what I expect to be a very interactive discussion after our panel's opening remarks. We're going to start with Ambassador Julian Braithwaite. Ambassador Braithwaite has had extraordinary experience turning conflict into opportunity from his earliest days working on behalf of the FCO in the war in Bosnia, Croatia, the conflict in Kosovo, secondment to NATO, not to mention the time he has spent at Downing Street, as well as the opportunity to engage with him directly when he was posted here to the embassy in Washington, D.C. He's also a man who clearly knows the opportunities in empowering women, particularly for his two daughters. And as the ambassador and permanent representative to the WTO, UN, and other international organizations in Geneva, there's clearly been a lot of opportunity to look and focus on not only how trade policy enables women, but how that enabling women becomes a great part of, as we go through these challenging COVID times, an opportunity to make progress going forward. After Ambassador Braithwaite, we'll hear from Ambassador Stephen de Boer, who is Canada's ambassador and permanent representative to the WTO, but also a significant history and experience in driving not only trade policy, but trade as creation of opportunities, working through conflicts in the early days around softwood lumber, but taking on opportunities, particularly in the environmental law division, to be working on international climate change negotiations, including serving as the Deputy Chief Negotiator in Environment Canada. Having been the ambassador to Poland and then Belarus, Ambassador de Boer has done a fantastic job really driving the conversation in Geneva as we focus on gender diversity and empowerment across the broader trade and sustainable growth space. And we'll be followed by our final panelist is Roberta Piermantini, who's the chief of the trade cost analysis at the WTO. In that role, Roberta really has not only brought her incredible technical expertise, but really ensuring that as we focus these conversations on what we need to do to bring more women into the economic empowerment space, really backing that up with the numbers and analysis that demonstrates the value opportunity we're looking to create here, including work as the author of a practical guide to trade policy modeling. Again, as we said from the outset, having a conversation that we can really base in the real world of numbers and practical recommendations that demonstrate women are going to be a significant portion of how we drive and restart the global trade economy, which has faltered so badly in these really trying times. I will turn first to Ambassador Braithwaite to make some opening remarks and start off our very interactive discussion today.
Thank you very much, Lisa, and it's a real pleasure to be here on this panel. Thank you for inviting me, but it's a real pleasure to be working with you again, as you say, after some time when we met in Washington. I mean, it does underpin just how important these networks are in the trade policy field, and also the way in which I think working again with colleagues over the years on these issues can really take forward important progress on these areas, and particularly on the issue we're talking about today. And I would like to start by thanking you, Lisa, for inviting me on the panel, and also Dorothy for your opening remarks. And I'm delighted to be here and representing the UK, which has played a role in funding the ITC report that we're launching today. As we've seen, increased trade can be a tremendous force for providing new opportunities for women, and a 2016 study by the International Trade Center found that women-owned businesses that export are on average more than 3.5 times more productive than those that don't. However, improving women's access to the benefits of trade remains this overarching challenge that we have all been focused on. There was, at the London-hosted Commonwealth Summit in 2018, the UK committed to establishing a gender-responsive trade policy. And 2 years on, it's been, I think, remarkable how much international expertise is growing, both in Geneva and in the WTO, but also in our new Department for International Trade, which has been sort of built up from scratch, really, after the last few years. And I would also like to thank the ITC for driving forward this agenda, and also working with us, I think, in the UK, as we've been building up our own policies in this area. So today I wanted to both reflect on the UK's progress on trade and gender equality, and to draw upon the 4 key challenges that today's ITC report sets out. for mainstreaming gender in free trade agreements. That is greater awareness, expertise, gender disaggregated data, and lastly, but perhaps most importantly, political will. Firstly, there is a need to increase awareness by looking beyond the visible. If we agree that trade is not gender neutral, or that trade outcomes vary by gender, then we also must acknowledge that many of the barriers for women in trade may be hidden. This report invites us to consider whether there is more to be done in trade agreements to address those barriers to trade faced by all, but which may be disproportionately experienced by women. And one important example is considering women-owned SMEs. Secondly, our stakeholders have made clear that much of the underpinning expertise comes from outside of government as well. And the UK recognises the importance of seeking the meaningful inclusion of women's voices through our policy development, and that we need more women in particular to participate in conversations around trade and indeed to participate in trade and trade negotiations. One of the objectives we've had with the Department of International Trade as we've been expanding has been to ensure that we're recruiting women into the DIT, particularly young women who could go on to become our senior trade negotiators and trade ambassadors in the future as the UK develops its own trade capability after many years of relying on the European Commission, and we've made that a priority in terms of our recruitment in the UK. Thirdly, the importance of gender disaggregated data. As the report makes clear, the impact of gender mainstreaming on women and trade will only become visible with the passage of time. To know if we're achieving our goals, we must be able to monitor them. Just yesterday, as we've heard, ITC Executive Director Dorothy Tembo and the UK's Minister for Africa launched the She Trades Outlook tool at the UN High-Level Political Forum. Part of the UK's Aid for Trade portfolio, this UK-funded data tool will show us best practices on trade and gender policies around the world, providing a crucial step forward in identifying, understanding, and addressing the barriers for women in international trade. Turning finally to political will. The UK government made clear in their manifesto that the future trade agreements will not only be free, but fair, and this includes seeking provisions that advance women's economic empowerment. This is also set out in our recently published negotiation objectives for the US, Australia, and New Zealand free trade agreements. But political will is not just about individual countries. It is also about the international trade community, and that's why commitments such as the Joint Declaration on Trade and Women's Economic Empowerment are so important. Looking forward to the next phase of the WTO's work, the UK strongly supports the creation of an informal working group on women's economic empowerment. We welcome the early proposals that this group should consider gender equality across WTO activities, which will ensure that gender equality in trade is no longer seen as a siloed issue. The UK is at the start of a journey to make our independent trade policy gender responsive. This report and these events are a huge step in the right direction as we look to enable women to benefit equitably from the opportunities of trade, whether as workers, business owners, or entrepreneurs. And as we forge our trade policy in the UK, we'll use our role as an independent, outward-looking, free trading nation to champion trade policies which advance women's economic empowerment. And so I'm very much looking forward to the discussions today and to progressing this important agenda together. Thank you very much, Lisa.
Apologies. Great comments, especially the point about political will and the need to drive this within the community. Very much part of our conversation today. Stephen.
Well, thank you very much for the invitation to participate. It's a pleasure for me to be with you today as part of this fantastic panel. And let me begin by congratulating you for organizing today's events. Despite the challenges of COVID-19 pandemic, we must continue to advance conversations on key global issues. The impacts of the twin crises born out of the pandemic, namely the human health crisis and the economic crisis, require coherent, collaborative, and coordinated international action. And while we continue to grapple with the profound human health emergency, we must also come to grips with the far-reaching and significant economic impacts of the pandemic. The pandemic has affected all sorts of businesses, regardless of size, geographic location, or industry. In particular, however, micro, small, and medium-sized enterprises remain perhaps the most vulnerable of all. In Canada, women-owned SMEs are more prevalent in areas of retail trade, accommodation, food services, and tourism, all industries that have been hit hard by the pandemic and areas that are all trade exposed. Supporting small businesses through the pandemic has been a priority for the Government of Canada, which has introduced programs including assisting with commercial rent, as well as providing emergency financing. As we look ahead, ensuring a sustainable and resilient economic recovery is the priority for governments all around the world. I would argue, however, that in order to be successful, the economic recovery must also be inclusive. This includes ensuring that women-owned or led businesses can succeed. And this is why Canada continues to work to open new export opportunities for women-led business, to pursue gender-responsive trade agreements, to work with partners here in Geneva to bring discussions on gender issues into the WTO, and to engage with partners in other fora to ensure that women's issues remain on top of the international agenda. Let me start with our efforts here in Geneva. As you know, Canada was a driving force behind the Buenos Aires Declaration on Trade and Women's Economic Empowerment. We led its implementation in Geneva by organizing the first workshop held under the auspices of the Declaration in March 2018, and by providing speakers for some of the other workshops organized by our partners. We're now looking to build on the success of the BA Declaration by working with our partners to define the next phase of our work. Critically, Canada believes that an integral element of this work should be to bring the discussions more formally into the WTO, as opposed to simply holding discussions at the WTO. We recognize that this is easier said than done, but we're committed to seeing this work through. In addition to the BA Declaration, we're also engaged in other efforts at the WTO on gender. For example, in the Joint Statement Initiative on Services Domestic Regulation, Canada is advocating for the inclusion of a provision on non-discrimination that supports women's economic empowerment. The proposal would help ensure that in committed sectors, a service supplier cannot, for example, be rejected when applying for a license to supply a service simply because they are female. Our engagement at the WTO is one example of a broader push by Canada's government to advance gender issues internationally. Bilaterally, Canada is pursuing an inclusive approach to trade that seeks to ensure that the benefits of trade are more widely shared among Canadians, including with underrepresented groups in trade such as women, SMEs, and Indigenous peoples. Canada seeks to remove barriers to trade by mainstreaming inclusive trade and gender-responsive provisions across our FTAs supported by gender-based analysis, GBA+. To date, Canada has 2 trade and gender chapters in force with Chile and Israel, and a trade and gender recommendation with the EU under CETA. Canada is conducting a comprehensive chapter-by-chapter GBA+ of the ongoing FTA negotiations with Mercosur, considering the effect on Canadian men and women across the economy in their roles as workers, business owners, and consumers. The findings of the GBA+ has led to the development of several new and innovative, inclusive and gender-responsive provisions across the full FTA to enhance opportunities and mitigate the risks of unintended consequences. More broadly, Canada continues to work to ensure that gender issues are advanced in various international fora. At the G20, for example, Canada is taking action to advance women's economic empowerment and participation in trade. Canada led the launch of the Private Sector Alliance for the Empowerment and Progression of Women's Economic Representation, or EMPOWER, initiative at the G20 summit in Osaka in 2019. The Alliance promotes private sector leadership in promoting women's entrepreneurship in G20 countries. We're pleased that developing and further engaging the private sector through the Empower initiative has been identified by the G20 Saudi Arabia presidency as an expected outcome in 2020. The goal is to have Empower to be a pathway for ambitious women's empowerment outcomes in all G20 countries. Under Canada's G7 presidency, concrete outcomes on women's economic empowerment were made, particularly through supporting lifelong learning and encouraging more women to study and pursue careers in STEM fields. At the OECD DAC, Canada is the lead donor in terms of supporting gender equality as a percentage of bilateral aid in 2020. Canada is proud of its international leadership and engagement on gender issues and committed to continue to support vulnerable populations and remove persisting barriers to women's economic empowerment. The COVID-19 pandemic has underlined the importance of international cooperation to address a global challenge. I believe that we will only be through similar international action that we can ensure that women and women-owned led businesses can fully participate in our economies and trade. For this reason, Canada will continue to work with our partners in order to help develop and implement the integrated and coherent policies necessary to achieve this objective. Thank you once again for inviting me to participate in today's discussion, and I look forward to the rest of the discussion and to any questions.
Thank you so much, Stephen, and thank you for the leadership as you demonstrated Canada's role in driving this conversation, especially at the G20. There's been an impressive conversation, not only in how we ensure, as Julian was saying before, the political will and the drive for all governments to recognize the opportunity at hand, but efforts that have gone into building up the voice of women in the process. Saudi establishing a task force specifically for women in business to bring that voice and that practical expertise to the table, give women an opportunity to be part of the conversation and driving these ideas has been truly impactful and quite frankly inspiring to see. So we appreciate the leadership, and I think it's been mentioned by both of you, really a key part of this is the role that women play in restoring, renewing, and driving the next phase of economic activity. So Roberta will be very interested in your perspective on how women's empowerment, not only how we can enable it, but really how women's empowerment is going to be part of that, part of the opportunity for the world to recover from COVID.
Thank you, Lisa. Thank you for organizing this panel and for inviting me. What I'd like to do is to start with a preview of some of the highlights of the report on women and trade that is being jointly written by WTO and the World Bank. A report that will be launched on the 30th of July, so at the end of the month, and aiming and explaining what is the role of trade in empowering women. One of the achievements of this report is that it does provide evidence that trade benefits women. And the reason why I say it's an achievement is because we have had an analysis at the country level so far, an analysis that show that open economies have higher level of gender equality, but we have much less information at the disaggregated level. And that's what we try to do. We actually, together with the report, launch also a new database with the disaggregated data on employment that we hope will set the stage for future research and analysis on policy implication in this. While writing the report, we realize often when analyzing policy options that countries have put in place, or provision and preferential trade agreements, that we can say what provisions are there, but we cannot say what provisions are actually effective. So this is a very important, I think, first a start for future analysis. What we have done in the report with this data is to provide evidence that open sectors have offered better conditions for women, more work and better paid job with better quality jobs. The report also identifies, and this is useful for our conversation today on catalyzing actions for women, 3 trends in trade that can be advantageous for women. And we identify the rise in services, the spread of global value chains, and the expansion of digital economies as 3 major opportunities for women in the future. The rise of the services economy is an opportunity for women because globally, the majority of women work in the services jobs. And at the same time, what's happening now is the services sector are becoming increasingly tradable. Think that since 2005, trade in services has been growing on average 17 percentage points faster than trade in goods. And Since women so far were in sectors that were not so tradable, there is actually a large margin for women to gain in services. Think, for example, of the fact that increasingly education and health services can be traded online. This gives new opportunities for women to achieve better outcomes, employment outcomes in sectors where they face much lower discriminations in general. Global value chains are an opportunity for women because global value chains lower the cost for small firms to enter into the international trade. So it would be very difficult for small firms to set up a whole production for a whole good distribution network worldwide. They can actually rely on supplying inputs to global value chains as a way to reach international markets. And we also show in the report the firms active in global value chains employ more women. And then digital technologies. Why are they an opportunity? Because actually digital technologies remove some of the major barriers that women face when trading, which is getting information, having in some cases a bank account to rely. New technologies allow women without a bank account to use digital payments, for example. They allow for faster trade, reduce the time required for trading, for exploring markets, and for shopping in inputs. And these are sort of significant reductions in trade costs. However, there are still significant barriers, and some of the barriers that have so far not very much highlighted that we bring up in the report is some evidence that there is, for example, a pink tariff. So sectors where more women work face higher tariffs in their destination markets as well as for their inputs. So in India, for example, we estimate about that this pink tariff is as high as about 6 percentage points. And it's not just a developing countries issue. We have similar trends for the US and Germany, even if the margin is not so large. We also know that in services trade costs are about double those in goods, and that where women are. Crossing borders is more challenging for women. When there are long time spent at the border, lack of transparency in the regulation, women are more exposed to harassment in this situation. So you can see here, from already analyzing these barriers, how important the role of international cooperation and the role also of what can be done at WTO is, what has been done, implementation of trade facilitation agreement in a way that is gender sensitive, the opening up of the services trade, and eventually, why not removing the pink tariff? They're also important behind the border barrier, and that is more a task for governments to deal with. Constraints like legal and social cultural barrier, clearly limited access to finance, I mentioned, and limited access to education. All these characteristics make women more vulnerable to changes in technologies, changes the trade brings, as well as the coronavirus. So the overall message of the report is actually to show that the important role the government and also private sector, civil society, international organizations can play in removing this barrier, and call for a collective effort of all stakeholders to fully materialize women's economic empowerment. And I stop here, and thank you for your attention.
Roberta, that is terrific, and a very inspiring segue too to maybe the start of our discussion. And for all three panelists, and I'd really welcome your thoughts. Maybe Roberta, where you just left off, we've talked a lot about the impact of COVID, as everyone does these days, understandably. And certainly, Stephen, as you mentioned, it has an extraordinary impact on a lot of women-dominated industries like tourism. But Roberta, you mentioned a number of areas of opportunity as we think about kind of the digital world and services space or participation in global value chains. You know, a lot of governments are starting to turn to this part of the conversation, the economic recovery, and whether that's, you know, national economic programs, opportunities for skills development. We've certainly learned a lot, and the She Trades program run by the ITC has been an extraordinary enabler of helping us understand the trade facilitation problems, the harassment issues, the women's access to expert networks that you had mentioned before. Can we go one step deeper as we think about, for this group especially, how can we work together to really tackle some of these specific areas, whether it's removing the pink tax or creating more opportunities for skills development for women, priority access to the stimulus type packages that many governments will do. What are some of the next steps that really help make women's empowerment a concrete part of the recovery? Julian, maybe I could ask you first in terms of post-COVID economic recovery. How do you see us getting more practical about the women's empowerment agenda?
Well, one of the, as the Street Trades Commonwealth survey shows, that actually women's businesses have been disproportionately affected because of the sectors they're in, I think the survey shows that, for example, in Ghana, Kenya, Nigeria, Bangladesh, over 40% of women's-owned businesses have had to cut employment because of COVID-19 or shut down temporarily. So there are particular sectors that are particularly affected by COVID-19. And one of the responses that we've been looking at is what we could do to support female entrepreneurs with training, particularly on digital literacy and financial management and e-commerce, and try and use those platforms as ways of overcoming some of the sort of the physical challenges that such businesses have faced. I mean, there's in some sectors it's easier to do than in others, of course, but that's been one of the things that we have been focusing on. Simply there's going to be an enormous need to push money and demand back into the economy, and one of the things that we've been doing is as well as trying to ensure that we're able to get to a place where actually businesses can work physically without fear of resurgence of the virus, and particularly pursuing a vaccine. Also putting $185 million into the IMF to help developing countries cope with economic impact. And I think one of the things we're going to need to look at there is quite how those sorts of policies are also gender sensitive, and that they're looking at how they can ensure that businesses, and particularly those that have been most affected by COVID-19, often women's-owned businesses, are understood and addressed by these economic stimulus and support programs.
Thank you. Roberta, Stephen, you guys want to weigh in on that?
Maybe just following actually what the ambassador said, and for instance, focusing on the digital technologies, it's one of the issues I touched upon before. The crisis actually showed how these digital technologies have been a way of resilience. Smart working have become the norm. Some of us are working from home, but this is not accessible to all. So skills indeed is a major issue, but it's not enough, because even once skills are done, what you will need to take into account is also that a lot of women also take care of children. So somehow there is a sense of, so somehow what is important to understand to solve this issue is that it's not just one policy, it's not just having access to technologies, but it's also skills to be able to use the technologies, and it's also a system of that allow women to use the technology and have their children looked after, for example.
So if I might, can you hear me? No, okay. What I think is really interesting about what Julian and Roberta have just talked about is what I would actually think about as mainstreaming gender in trade and trade negotiations, and understanding those crosswalks. So both Julian and Roberta talked about e-commerce and e-commerce platforms, and that makes a lot of sense, and it is one of those areas where we should be thinking about our participation in rulemaking around e-commerce, for example, has a very clear gender benefit. And so when we have to make sure that we don't think about trade and gender just in this very particular sort of rarefied atmosphere, but that we actually bring it home to those rule-making exercises. And so, and that's why Canada is pushing for language and services domestic regulation, because women do provide services and are discriminated. So let's make sure that we create rules that prevent that from happening. The discussions at the WTO on MISMES has a very large gender angle to it. So that is important. What is interesting about COVID-19, I think the good news on COVID-19 is that we're actually measuring and surveying what the impact of COVID-19 is on women-owned businesses. And that's a fairly exciting development, because we have spent a lot of time imagining and assuming that economic policies are gender neutral and that trade provisions are gender neutral. And we know that they're not. So we need to we have to start asking the questions and start getting the data together so that we can actually have a response that is gender sensitive, obviously, but also, I mean, the reason we're doing this is that we'll have the best response and economic policies possible, the ones that actually are targeted to those that need the support. And so that's the good news. I think the bad news is that we're still having a conversation here in Geneva and in other places that these are neutral, and they're neutral in their application. They're neutral on their face and in their application, and we know that they are not. But COVID-19 is forcing some of these really interesting discussions, and forcing them in, I think, a very positive way.
Thank you. That actually leads to another question, and I think as both of you have mentioned, with the role that your governments are playing in driving this conversation and ensuring that gender is part of the FTA negotiation process. Obviously, as you know, USMCA, for example, just entered into force a few days ago. And as always with these agreements, getting the language included in the deal is the important first step. But it's implementation and enforcement, the follow-on, that really creates opportunities for women. So particularly as we think about the WIIT community, you know, how can we do more to work together as kind of women-driven businesses and leader executive roles to work with governments to ensure that as these issues get incorporated into the trade policy agenda, that we're really making sure that they're effectively implemented. In essence, we get to the kind of benefits and goals that Roberta's been talking about how we really make a difference for women to, you know, take up that entrepreneurial role and be successful. How can we do more to partner with you on the real implementation and enforcement side?
Well, sorry, Roberta. I didn't see your you go green there. I would say a couple of things. The one is what we cannot forget is that when we sign international trade agreements, there is a domestic implementation aspect to it. It's not just a matter of our leaders signing these things and off we go. They do need to be implemented, and there are opportunities there that when countries implement their trade agreements, so they actually do it in ways that are gender sensitive and actually advance the agenda. And so there is a responsibility beyond the agreements themselves for governments to actually do things that could advance the file. The other thing I would say is that I think it's helpful to identify the possible benefits from using a gender lens, instead of saying, well, we think it will impact this sector or that sector. Drill down even deeper. And there are crosswalks, significant crosswalks, particularly in the Canada-US context, between groups where they can actually work together. And so some of the really practical things that were mentioned here about mentoring, about leadership, about demonstrating how these things are done, is now in a is now trilateralized, I would say, and we should be seizing those opportunities to trilateralize them and learn from each other. There are things that Canada can learn from the United States, and I think vice versa. There are probably things we can learn from Mexico. We need to be having that discussion. So it's not, but all that to say, there's homework for all of us to do.
May I come in at this point?
Please, please, Dorothy.
Thank you so much. Very much agreeing with a number of the points that have been made in the context of the last question, and indeed in the context of the current question. And in a way, the two questions, in my view, overlap to some extent. But what I wanted to say from our work, what we have established is that in certain respects, there have been positive steps that have been taken towards ensuring that the gender elements are included in the bilateral or regional agreement. But it's the domestication or operationalization of those elements at the national level, or indeed at the regional level, but more so at the national level. And this is where I think much of the problem is. I mean, even in the context of the issues that we are raising in relation to ensuring that we are progressively moving in the direction where there is gender being integrated within the context of the WTO. A priority number one, and we're right behind that. But what we have to do is raising our ambition to go beyond doing what we are doing in the Geneva context, to take it more to the ground, because that's where the operation is. That's where you want the women to actually be able to benefit from these provisions. And within that context, what I would suggest is that we need to get together as partners, more interaction around, with the different partners, drawing on the different expertise to be able to take forward the concrete priorities that have been identified, whether it's in the context of the discussions in Geneva or indeed in a regional context, that you're then making that more granular and applicable for women to be able to take advantage of this. This is what we have to do. And I would see that this is where there would be scope for WIIT to work with partners like the WTO, ourselves, and indeed other stakeholders at the country level. We need to be making sure that people understand that women understand what is expected from the governments in terms of implementing the various commitments, but there are also implementation aspects that have to be implemented or taken forward by women associations at the country level. And we have to have a very clear understanding, which is where the She Trades Outlook 2 becomes important, because you're clearly identifying where the gaps are. And I'm not saying this is the only tool. There are other tools that can also be used, but we bring all this work together through the various institutional structures that are set up at the country level that are inclusive and ensure that they are representative of the various categories of women. Because I think sometimes we tend to perhaps generalize the categorization of women. I think when I look at our work for export-ready women, they are normally in a position to move forward with whatever support is provided. But if we're being inclusive, we have to also look at the category of women that are not yet ready, but will need the help to be able to get to a position of exporting. COVID-19 has just compounded an already challenging situation. It's the same issues: access to information, access to finance, access to markets. The same is what we are seeing from the analysis that we have done, but they're at a very compounded level. Today, there are stimulus packages or grants being offered to some of the SMEs, but they cannot access the resources that are available because they don't know the information, they don't know what requirements are. So it's the same issues, but being presented in a different way. And here I do agree that the more we can have options in terms of trying to support the small players to be able to navigate this complex situation, the better for the companies.
Excellent action. Julian, please.
Just Lisa, coming back to your question about sort of how do we actually make this, get these things, get this implemented. I mean, I think it'd be interesting, and I guess this work probably has been done already, but to sort of study which elements of FTAs of the sort of that are gender supportive elements of FTAs that actually make a difference, the ones that have actually been seen to help the most, and get that sort of comparative analysis. Come back to Stephen's point that we can learn from others. I think learning from the new FDAs that are being developed that do address this issue, and understanding which ones have actually worked the best in practice. But I think, again, coming back to Stephen's point that implementation is about domestic implementation. It's about actually helping the businesses themselves access the opportunities that these agreements in theory give them. And we do this obviously with all of our businesses through our trade promotion agencies, and they help the different exporters in different sectors where there's been liberalization. They help them to understand those opportunities. And maybe we should also be targeting those trade promotion agencies that do follow up after the trade deal is done to help the businesses access those opportunities, to think through the implications of how you support women-only businesses in particular, accessing what those agreements may give them support and access to, but actually making sure that those follow-up agencies are following up specifically with women-only businesses. I mean, that's our own agencies do that in our own countries. Question is, could they also help the other partner, particularly in developing countries? Could they provide, as part of their sort of technical assistance that they provide, not just to their own business, say back in the UK, women's only business back in the UK, but also, say, if it was an FTA with Kenya, the Kenyan businesses as well? Could we be looking at those agencies, which tend to be quite well resourced by global standards, see if they could play a role in helping following up on those FTAs with both partners to the agreement?
Terrific and very actionable ideas there, Julian. Thank you. I'm actually going to open it up. I know we had Suama Santos, who's been one of the leaders really in establishing women inside trade in Brazil, bringing that community into this debate. And I know, Suama, you had a really interesting question around kind of the multilateral governance aspects of this as well. Do you want to go ahead and unmute yourself and briefly ask your question?
Sure, Lisa, thank you very much. Thank you all panelists. It was a very interesting debate up to now. Although I do agree that most of the approach of empowering women depends on domestic implementation. Indeed, the international cooperation environment, it's critical for that. And what we have seen up to now on the COVID world, and what we can expect from a post-COVID international system governance, it's having much more to competition than cooperation. So I would like to understand from the panelists, what are their view on where we are heading to a multilateral system, because the multilateral system effectiveness in promoting cooperation is critical to move forward the agenda we are debating here about empowering women and also incorporate gender-based approach to trade negotiations. Thank you so much, Lisa.
Clearly plays into the race for a new Director General as well. Great opportunity to really restart an empowered agenda. Thoughts on, Stephen, that aligns back to comments you made before too about the need for greater cooperation amongst governments. Do you see opportunities at a time when there's so much change and transition going on? How can we do more to foster and steer our governments towards areas of cooperation?
Well, honestly, I think there are elements of the pandemic that would suggest a more competitive environment and a bigger than neighbor environment. But overall, I think what COVID-19 has shown us is the need that it is a pandemic, so it's a global issue that requires a global response. And so this is an opportunity for multilateralism to shine. When you think about supply chains, for example, for medical goods or health goods, when you think about food, what's really interesting about this pandemic as opposed to the Great Recession of 2008 is that food actually and food security has not been called into serious question, mostly because of multilateral cooperation. And so I think COVID-19 has shown us the need for transparency, the need for cooperation, the need for understanding supply chains. And so there are some very good opportunities. We have to make sure, and we have to be very vigilant to make sure that we don't slide the other way, but we should see this as an opportunity for multilateral approaches. What will be very important in the context of this discussion is that we don't lose sight of the gender angle to all of this, and thankfully that seems to be there. People are measuring this, which is very important, because if you don't measure it, we can't really develop a policy response to help.
Great points. And I know we've just about come to our time. I knew obviously it was such a huge topic to take up. I knew an hour was not going to be nearly enough to cover it. But it also demonstrates just how much opportunity exists in this space. Not only the value that women's economic empowerment can bring back to the global economy, but the tremendous efforts that are taking place by governments, by the ITC, in conjunction with the WTO and the World Bank. This is clearly an area, as we said from the outset, we want to catalyze further action. So I want to make sure that we're respectful of everybody's time. Certainly, if any of our panelists, Dorothy, if you have closing comments that you want to make, please let me know. We'd be happy to have kind of your final thoughts, and then we can wrap up. Okay. I know, folks, obviously there's a lot going on these days, and we do have, and the World Economic Forum has been very kind to allow us to run this as a side event to a much broader trip they're organizing for today. I really do want to go back, and I think, Dorothy, I'm borrowing your line about, I feel like one of the greatest outcomes of this conversation is to raise the ambition and to take up so many of these ideas and areas of opportunity and continue to work together as WIIT, as WIIT DC, as WIIT Geneva and London and Brazil, Zimbabwe, wherever else we can operate on the planet to bring kind of real concrete practical conversations to the table. We are certainly going to be following up, and I think, Roberta, we'll continue to talk to you further, as well as with our World Bank colleagues, about the next report that you have coming out. I know we had a question about how we can use so much of this methodology to really drive a much more concrete, an economic rationale to the discussion that maybe helps us drive the political will that all of you have talked about today. There's also an event on July 17th. I'm going to put out the link really quick in the chat function as well, that the Global Alliance for Free Trade is running in conjunction with WIIT Zimbabwe about empowering women through trade facilitation. So welcome the opportunity for anyone to sign up for that conversation. I would encourage everyone, as Dorothy noted in her early remarks, at shetrades.com, download the ITC report and really start fostering this further conversation. What can we do to take these recommendations and make them practical next steps? As WIIT DC, WIIT will be looking at follow-on conversations on the World Bank WTO report, as well as we're putting together an event with our colleagues in Kenya around women's economic empowerment through the US-Kenya FTA. So to everybody, thank you for participating. Thank you especially for our panelists. You've given us so many really, truly thoughtful ideas and, quite frankly, very practical, actionable steps that we can look forward to taking forward in partnership with you. You've been very kind with your time and your insights today. And I know with the audience across our Women in Trade community, we're going to look forward to being part of how women's economic empowerment continues to become an integrated part of the agenda. So thank you to everybody
Thank
for
you.
participating today. Please don't hesitate to follow up and look forward to keeping you engaged in this conversation. Thanks especially to our panelists, Dorothy, ITC. Thank you so much for the partnership.
Thank you very much. Thank you, everybody.
Very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.